Everybody, welcome back to my channel, and if you're new to my channel, hi, my name is Caitlin Elliott, and I cover true crime cases on Tuesdays and Fridays. So my Tuesday cases are usually, more modern, happened more recently, and on Fridays I talk about more vintage cases. And in my last video, we talked about the case of Mary Jane Barker, which was a very, very confusing child case that happened back in the 50s. And I thought today, we haven't really talked much about a serial killer ever since I talked about the Golden State Killer. So I thought to myself, man, why not just cover the case of a serial killer? So today we're going to be talking about the unsolved California hitchhike killer that happened in Santa Rosa County. Have you guys actually heard about this case? Because whenever I was researching to find a serial killer to cover, I was like, oh my gosh, I've never heard of this. And it happened around the same time as Ted Bundy, the Zodiac Killer, the Golden State Killer, and nobody has talked about this guy. So I was just like, wow, I'm gonna cover this case. So this case takes place in a city in California called Sonoma. And it's a small town in the northern part of California in the Santa Rosa County. The city of Sonoma was actually a very heavily populated city back in the 1970s when this case takes place. And it was actually the most populated city in the entire Santa Rosa County itself. Santa Rosa County was actually known for its beauty, and it was considered actually one of the most beautiful counties in the state of California, if not the most beautiful one. And because this case talks very heavily about hitchhiking, I want to provide a definition of what hitchhiking is. And it's a way of traveling by getting free rides and passing vehicles. You would stick out your thumb, someone would pull over and ask where you needed to go. You would get in the car and you would go off, and you wouldn't know these people. This was a very popular mode of transportation that was done back in the 1960s and 70s, and it was mostly used to travel around the state of California, or to get to California, if you will. So, for a majority of this video, I am going to be talking about the victims of the serial killer. And without further ado, that's when I'm going to get into today's case by talking about our very first victims. So the first known victims of the Santa Rosa hitchhiker killer was, they were two girls that were from the local area named Yvonne Lisa Weber, and she was 13 years old. And her best friend was named Maureen Sterling, and she was 12 years old. Yvonne, she was born on January 29th of 1959 in Nevada, but her family actually ended up moving to California shortly after she was born to, get a better life for themselves out there. Yvonne's parents, they ended up actually divorcing when she was very young, and her mother, whose name was Sheila, she ended up remarrying to a man named David Harrington. Yvonne, she was given full custody. Oh, not given full custody. She was in full custody, of Sheila and David Harrington. And they lived together in a home that was in Santa Rosa, California. In 1972, the year that she went missing, she was a 7th grade student at the Herbert Slater Middle School. And it was there that she ended up meeting a young girl named Maureen Sterling. And the two of them instantly clicked and became like best friends, like inseparable. And Maureen, she was actually only a couple months younger than Yvonne. So Maureen Sterling, she was actually born in Santa Rosa, and she was raised there with her family. Maureen was said to have been a very friendly and outspoken, quite popular, and she was never really shy. She just always voiced her opinion. She didn't care what anybody thought. And her father died at the age of 23 from a weird freak water skiing accident before Maureen was actually even born. And she, along with her older sister named Teresa, ended up being raised by their single mother back in Santa Rosa. On Friday, February 4th of 1972, 13-year-old Yvonne and 12-year-old Maureen, they decided they were going to go to the Redwood Empire Ice Arena. This was in Santa Rosa, California, which at the time was an ice skating rink that was known as Snoopy's Home Ice. So right now it is known as the Redwood Empire Ice Arena, but back then it was known as Snoopy's Home Ice. And actually had opened back in 1969. It was owned by the creator and the cartoonist of the Peanuts cartoons themselves. His name was Charles M. Schulz. I'm sure you guys know who I'm talking about. The rink was incredibly popular, and it was a very popular hangout area for teens and young kids, I guess you could say adolescents, preteens. And there was actually a lot of people there that day. Around 7 p.m. that day, the girls were dropped off by a mother, wasn't specified which one. And when that same mother came back to pick up the girls, they were gone. This was around 11 o'clock at night. So the mothers, they went inside of the ice skating rink, and nobody could find the girls. Nobody had seen them. And so she ended up calling the other girl's mother. Remember, they didn't have cell phones back then, so she had to call in on the phone that they had at the home ice. So she called the girl's mother to see if she had picked up the girls, but the mother had answered and said, no, they're supposed to be waiting for you. So this confused the mother that was going to go pick them up, and she realized immediately that something was just terribly wrong. It was like, the girls were not ones that would completely disregard the fact that they needed to get picked up by their mother. So it was just so weird. The parents of Yvonne and Maureen, they actually ended up reporting both of the girls missing that same night. On Saturday, February 5th of 1972, the Santa Rosa County Police, they start an official investigation into the disappearance of both girls. The police, they began interviewing dozens of witnesses that had been at Snoopy's home ice the day that the girls went missing. And they wanted to establish exactly what time it was that they went missing, what they had been doing before they disappeared. And they were said that they had left the facility to start hitchhiking back home. While the two had been hitchhiking, a separate witness had come forward and claimed that they saw the two of them get into an unknown vehicle, and this vehicle was on Gurneyville Road. Because this witness only had a slight glimpse of what had happened, they weren't able to provide a proper description of what the car looked like, what the driver looked like. They were just only able to provide what they remembered seeing. That same day, there was actually a separate call that was made from a different witness to have claimed to have seen the girls at a bowling alley. And this bowling alley was actually close to where the Snoopy's home ice rink was. However, when police started to investigate those leads, they realized they were never there. The police stated that they started their search for the girls in Santa Rosa, California, but it quickly spread all over the state, because whenever you're hitchhiking, you can travel to all these different places. So they had no idea if they were even still in the state of California, but they had to go out and do what they could to help. The police interviewed many people. They put up flyers, even talking about the disappearance of the girls on the radio and on local news stations and on television. Unfortunately, nothing came from this, and 2 weeks passed with zero sightings of the girls. And so the police assumed, can you guess what they assumed? That they were runaways. A 12-year-old girl and a 13-year-old girl were runaways. Not to mention, the police assumed that they didn't even want to be found, and they decided that they were just going to cancel the search altogether. They weren't going to look for them anymore. They didn't want to be found. Not even a whole month later, there was another young girl in the Santa Rosa Valley area who goes missing. So this will be 3 now. Kim Wendy Allen was born on July 22nd, 1952 in California, and she went to an all-girls school called Ursuline High School in Santa Rosa, California, and she lived here with her parents and her siblings. Kim was said to have been a very shy girl, and she would never want to get in any type of trouble. So in 1972, she was a student at the Santa Rosa Junior College, and remember that name because a lot of the victims were involved with that college. And she was there on a scholarship. And when Kim wasn't studying or in school, she would work part-time at a natural foods grocery store. Natural foods are very popular back in that day, the hippie lifestyle. You know, you want to get everything to be homegrown. They wanted gardens. They just want everything to be fresh and natural. So Kim, she only lived 2 blocks away from the same road where Yvonne and Maureen were last seen hitchhiking on. And she lived on that road, like I said, with 2 of her roommates, and she wouldn't be by herself and she did not know how to drive. So when it came to her getting anywhere, she would have to hitchhike. So when Kim told her parents about her hitchhiking, they strongly opposed against it. And they warned her about the dangers of hitchhiking, but she just continued their warnings and would continue hitchhiking. The last time that Kim Allen was seen was on March 4th of 1972. Kim was actually traveling from Santa Rosa to San Francisco, which was an hour-and-a-half drive from Santa Rosa. And this would have been a 15-and-a-half-hour hike for her. So, like I mentioned before, Kim did not know how to drive, so she would walk and she would try to pick up rides by hitchhiking. And on this particular day, Kim actually had a shift for her job that afternoon. She did, in fact, go to hitchhike to her job, and she worked there for 6 hours. So she gets off, and she starts to hitchhike back to her home because work was done. She managed to get picked up by 2 unknown men who had been traveling to San Rafael, California, and they dropped Kim off before watching her attempt to hitchhike again on Highway 101. For those who don't know, Highway 101 is a very famous highway route that stretches from the state of Washington through Oregon and goes through a majority of California, of the West Coast part of it, the ocean side. To this day, there's so many people that have died on that highway, just gone missing from hitchhiking or just gone missing from in general. People have been hit by cars there, and people have been abducted and murdered. So it's a very, very dangerous place. So the last people to see Kim saw her hitchhiking on Highway 101. However, based on this sighting of her, it was unclear of whether she went after, where she went after this sighting, and nobody even saw Kim get into a vehicle. It just seemed like she just completely, just disappeared. Nobody knew where she went. The following day after Kim went missing, there were these 2 local high schoolers who were driving around the area on motorcycles. As they were driving on Highway 101, they stumbled across the body of a woman that was floating in the creek that was nearby. The motorcyclists, obviously they're freaking out. So they go and they run to a payphone, because like I said, they don't have cell phones back then. They run to a payphone and they immediately call the police to let them know, hey, there's a dead body right over here. And the police quickly arrive at the scene of the crime. The police, they inspect the area and they quickly discover that this person was an obvious victim of foul play. Her body was nude. It had been tied up, hog-tied, and she was laying face down on the ground. And her hands, her wrists and ankles were actually tied so tight that it left bruising and cut off her circulation. Her hands were actually purple. There was evidence on the Jane Doe's body that showed signs of stabbings and sexual assault as well, along with her official cause of death being listed as strangulation. When an autopsy was done on this Jane Doe, it was discovered that she had actually died around March 4th of 1972. So 4 days after this, Kim Allen's roommates, they actually called into the Santa Rosa County Police Station, and they think that the Jane Doe might possibly be their friend Kim Allen. The potential identity was actually confirmed through DNA and fingerprints that the Jane Doe was, in fact, Wendy Allen. So this is 3 people and 1 Jane Doe so far. Where the body of Kim was found and researched by police, they ended up finding a leg imprint. And this was not far from where the body was, and it was determined that this leg imprint was caused by the killer. The killer apparently had slipped in the mud and had fallen, and it left their leg imprint there. So the police, they figured that he might have injured himself while falling down there. Pretty soon, the Santa Rosa County Police, they started getting their first suspect. There was a young 20-year-old local resident, and he had been arrested for actually sexually assaulting an 18-year-old female. So, whenever he went up to her, the unknown suspect, whenever he went up to her, he attacked her with a knife and actually held her at knife point. After he was arrested, the police, they began to interrogate the suspect, but after a while they couldn't find any type of evidence that could link him to the murder of Kim. So he was completely dismissed. The second suspect was named Robert Lee Bouchon, and he was arrested to be questioned about the murders. Robert had actually abducted a young woman who had coincidentally been hitchhiking, and he had threatened her with a knife before abducting her and taking her back to his house. This is when he forced the unknown 18-year-old girl to get undressed, and he tied her up with ligatures. I don't know about you guys, but it seems like the other murders that we just discussed, like they were hog-tied and everything. They were tied up, you know, that literally sounds the same. Oh, but luckily, this woman was able to escape before she was able to get murdered. And she did this whenever her abductor had fallen asleep. However, police were unable to connect the crime with the murders, and luckily, Robert was actually arrested for kidnapping the young woman, so thank God he was off the streets. Kim Allen, one of the victims that was identified, her clothes started showing up just randomly scattered all over the locations around the Santa Rosa area. So her checkbook was actually found just stuffed in a random person's mailbox. They opened up her mail, like someone went to go and open up their mailbox, and there was her checkbook just laying there. So the owner of the mailbox, they quickly alerted the police, like, there's someone's checkbook in here, and they quickly tested the checkbook, and they later found out that the checkbook had actually belonged to the killer, not Kim. Yeah. So the police want to compare the fingerprints to Kim, but I don't think they had anything done about this. I couldn't find anything like that in my research. As this was going on, a fourth girl from the Santa Rosa County area disappeared, and this young woman's name was Jeanette Kamahale. Jeanette Kamahale was born on February 19th of 1952, and she is from a predominantly Hawaiian background, which I found interesting because I live in Hawaii. So before moving to the United States, Jeanette, she had actually grown up in Japan, and her father was actually a member of the United States military, the United States Navy, I believe. And after Jeanette graduated from high school, she wanted to actually move back to the United States to continue college, and she did so, enrolling in the Santa Rosa Junior College. And in fact, Jeanette would often hitchhike there. So it was stated that Jeanette would hitchhike nearly daily just to get anywhere she needed to go to. And what I found, I actually thought about this, and what I found really interesting was I didn't know whether or not Jeanette actually knew Kim Allen because they both went to the same college, because that would have been like a link in the cases, and it would have made sense if that was a possibility, but who knows. On Tuesday, April 25th of 1972, Jeanette, she left her home that morning for her first college class that day. Before she started leaving for class, Jeanette, she tells her roommates that she was going to hitchhike to class, and they didn't think anything about it because that's how she would get around. She would just hitchhike everywhere. However, by nighttime, Jeanette had still not returned home from her college classes. The roommates at the time, Nora, she became really concerned, and she ended up calling the Santa Rosa Junior College to see if Jeanette was still over there at the college. Like, you know, she hasn't left. What's going on? There is no sign of her, and on April 26, 1972, when she still hadn't returned, Nora's called the police. Like, my roommate's missing, there's something wrong. The police, right away, they had a whole other approach to her case than the other ones, because they knew she wasn't a runaway. Unlike most of the other girls, Jeanette had been living on her own and did not have a troubled life to run from. As the Santa Rosa police, they started looking at her case, they realized it was actually incredibly similar to the disappearance of Kim, as both Kim and Jeanette had been hitchhiking right before they disappeared. Police began to wonder if maybe the disappearances were related to the murder of Kim. So investigators, they began asking around to see where Jeanette was and what she had been doing before she vanished, and it was then revealed that Jeanette was last seen on the on-ramp of Highway 101 attempting to hitchhike. A friend of hers actually spotted her, and this friend, along with the other passengers, they had attempted to pull over and give Jeanette a ride, but before they could, there was another vehicle that had pulled up to her, and she got in. The vehicle was described as a 1950s era pickup truck with a faded brown wooden camper that was attached to the bed of the truck. The driver of the truck was described to the police as a Caucasian male between the ages of 30 to 40 years old with his brown hair that was like styled in an afro. He either was said to have a beard or he had sideburns. They weren't able to tell, and he was said to have been a very tall individual. Police started searching for this individual along with a description of the truck, but unfortunately nothing came from this. As of March 20th, 2022, Jeanette is still a missing person to this day. Her case is said to be linked to the Hitchhiker killer, but it has never been fully confirmed. In December of 1972, there was a set of human remains that were discovered by a young couple who were going for a nature walk in the Rincon Valley near Santa Rosa. Obviously, this rattled the couple because they were like, what the hell? They were just terrified. And they reported this to the Santa Rosa County Police Department at 3 p.m. that same afternoon. When the police arrived to the scene, they stumbled across the nude, frozen body of a young woman. It was obvious that she had been there for a very long time. Police and coroners concluded that she had actually died from suffering a broken neck, and this had left her completely paralyzed, so she ended up freezing to death. After stating this, the same coroner eventually says, I actually don't know how she died, but I do know she had a broken neck. So, I don't know, he just confused himself. She ultimately died from her injuries, and police started looking through her dental records, because this was how they were able to identify Jane and John Doe's back in the day, because they didn't have DNA back then. And they were able to identify this Doe as Lori Lee Cursa. Lori was born in February of 1959 and had only been 13 years old at the time of her death. Lori was a student at Lawrence Cook Middle School in Santa Rosa, where she was in the 8th grade. She had sort of a reputation of being a constant runaway, and sometimes she would end up staying with friends. Even though Lori was only 13 years old, she was known to be an active hitchhiker. She would hitchhike everywhere. She was actually reported missing the day. It was a day where Lori and her mother were together, and they were at a grocery store. And she had gotten into a fight with her mother, and Lori took off running, and that was the last time her mother saw her. After her initial disappearance, there were rumors swirling around the Santa Rosa area that Lori was here, there. They just had rumors of where her location was. So people started claiming that Lori was at a friend's house, or that she had actually traveled to Florida where her father was living, and it was just unclear of where Lori had actually said she was traveling to before she left. So over time, there were alleged sightings of Lori in the local Santa Rosa area, and because of so many conflicting stories about her, people had they struggled to figure out exactly to pinpoint the location of where she was exactly. People claim to have last seen her supposedly on November 30th, 1972, while attempting to hitchhike to Santa Rosa, California. And once police had identified Lori as the Jane Doe, people started trying to figure out what exactly had happened to her. They started considering the possibility that she may have jumped from the car that she was in, and she ended up falling because she didn't know about the drop and landed and broke her neck, which is a possibility. It's not 100% sure how exactly she ended up dead. Not long after Lori's identification of the Jane Doe, an unknown man he calls into the Santa Rosa Police Department. The man starts to tell the police that he actually witnessed a very bizarre occurrence that made him extremely concerned. This man claimed the occurrence happened around the first week of December, but he was unclear of which date exactly it was. He just knew it was around the first week of December. This man had been traveling home from work that particular evening, and he remembered seeing a young girl that had matched Lori Cursa's description that was leaving an apartment building in Santa Rosa, California. The man then claimed that he saw a very strange-looking van that was lurking across the street from the apartment building he saw the girl leave from before she went inside the van. This man describes the unknown driver as, can you guess it, a white male with an afro-style haircut. So everything's starting to sound pretty damn familiar to that. It has to be the exact guy that everyone's seeing. you really would think the police would start putting two and two together, you know? Oh my gosh, you know, there's this guy over here, all these girls are going missing, and everyone's seeing this guy with an afro and this sketchy looking van. But to their surprise, well, to no one's surprise, really, everyone's just runaways. Witnesses claimed to police that they'd all seen two other men, along with the driver, who had lured or forced Lori into this weird-looking van that everyone had been seeing going around the city. The witnesses told police that the men were moving her very quickly into the van. They either rushed her in or forced her in, and they left towards the area where Lori's remains would later be found. Police then believed, based on this information, that Lori had actually been abducted by a group of unknown young men. Like, oh shit, you don't say, you got an issue on your hands, dude. So this really complicated things for the police, because instead of searching for one person, they had a group of suspects who had forced Lori to take her clothes off before killing her. And of course, none of this could be verified to have occurred, but this is what the police theorize happened. On Thursday, December 28th of 1972, there was a huge break in the killings that made police realize that, oh my god, the cases are linked. There was an embankment that was right off of the Franz Valley Road, where a few teenagers, they were walking around, you know, joking, acting like a bunch of teenagers do, having a good old time. And this would quickly change when the teenagers actually found the deceased remains of two young children. The remains were extremely decomposed, and it seemed like the identities would be almost impossible to find out. However, after the teenagers called the police, they were quickly able to observe the crime scene and identify the heavily decomposed bodies of 13-year-old Yvonne Weber and 12-year-old Maureen Sterling. The police had identified their bodies 10 months after their initial disappearances. The girls' bodies were found completely nude, and all the belongings they had with them whenever they were going to the ice skating rink and they were hitchhiking were gone. So their belongings, like I said, were gone, and their clothes as well were gone. Because of how decomposed their bodies were at the time of discovery, police actually were unable to determine the cause of their deaths. Santa Rosa County Police, they ended up getting a whole horde of negative press from what had happened about the girls' bodies being found, because the police did nothing to search for them, and the public started to think that the girls would have been found earlier if they would have actually searched for them instead of saying, oh my god, they're a runaway. People thought the friends would still be alive and everything because of that. And however, there was a lot of teenagers and young adults who were runaways during that time, and unfortunately, you know, the police, they started to assume everybody that was leaving or disappearing everywhere had to have been a runaway, unfortunately. On July 31st, 1973, nearly 17 months after the killings first started, there was a motorcyclist, and he was traveling on the Franz Valley Road, and this particular stretch of the road actually went through a small area of forest. So he started to smell something that was like really rancid and putrid, and it started making him sick to his stomach, and he was like, what the hell is that smell? So he started to think that it was like a dead animal. He's like, it has to be a dead animal. So he pulls over and he starts searching around to see if he could find this dead animal. And while he was searching, he could not find the cause of the smell. He couldn't even find the animal. So when he could not find out the source of it, he just hopped back on his bike and he rode away. So because of the horrible feeling that the gut feeling he had that something was just very wrong, he eventually called the police and said, hey, you know, I smell this stench over here off of this road. Please go and check it out. I feel like this is very uncomfortable. There's got to be something going on. The police arrived at the scene later that evening. They quickly discovered that this is in fact the same spot where they had actually found a body prior. And as the police searched the area, they find another body that was down in the embankment, and this was another body of a young woman who had been nude. The police inspect the body, and they discovered that the Jane Doe was between the ages of 14 and 16. And the reason why I'm calling her a Jane Doe is, like I said, she hasn't been fully identified yet at this point. And The set of remains that the motorcyclist found were actually only a couple yards away from where the young girls' bodies were found, the very first victims of the killings. An autopsy was done to show that she had been deceased for 72 hours, which is 3 days. The cause of her death for this doe could not be determined, and they could not determine whether or not the Jane Doe had even been sexually assaulted. They could not get any fingerprints from the Jane Doe because her body was far too decomposed, and they quickly said, what can we do to figure this out? So they found her, they were able to get a copy of her dental records to identify her, and after they put the description out to the local news stations, a woman calls in to the police station and says, "Hey, I think that body might be my younger sister." So the police then compared DNA from this woman to DNA of the Jane Doe, and they found it to be a complete match. The woman, she was then identified as 15-year-old Carolyn Davis. Carolyn Nadine Davis, she was born on December 3rd of 1957, and she grew up and lived in Northern California. On February 6th of 1973, good Lord, Carolyn left her family home, and she was last seen going to her high school, and she was wearing a brown jacket and blue jeans. And unfortunately, Carolyn never made it to school that day, and initially people had assumed that she had just run away. So when she hadn't returned home from missing school or running away, the police were, the parents reported their daughter missing to the police. So it was initially thought that Carolyn had gone to San Diego, so her parents weren't worried. They just put it out there so she would be safe. A few weeks after she vanished, they received a letter from her with a location that stated Soledad, California. This said that Carolyn had run away and she was never coming home. And this was just a few weeks before she went missing. So a few weeks after she vanished, like I said, this was a few weeks after she went vanished, so this is before she died. Sorry, I'm sorry, I confused myself. The letter said that Carolyn had run away and was never coming home. This was just 2 weeks before her body had been found, and she had actually traveled 150 miles away from her home to her grandmother's house by hitchhiking. And Carolyn, she pretty much only traveled by hitchhiking. Her grandmother stated that she last saw her in July of 1973 on Highway 101 while she was hitchhiking with some friends. A few weeks after her body had been found, police discovered her cause of death was by strychnine poisoning, which is a very toxic poison that was used to kill rats. If you breathe it in, you swallow it, anything like that, it can cause you to have seizures and you will die. So essentially that's what happened to Carolyn. On December 28th of 1973, the police were called to yet another crime scene, and this was in the Mark West Creek near Santa Rosa. A couple teenagers had actually been hanging out by the creek, and they stumbled across the nude body of a young woman who had been tied to a large log that was possibly used in an attempt to sink the body. The doe had been hog-tied, and there was a piece of clothesline that was used to tie her arms and legs together, with her thumbs tied so tight that they had started to lose circulation, and they were literally purple. She had a noose that went down from her neck down to her ankles, and even though she had only been dead for a couple of days, the police were unable to determine her cause of death. The week just before her body had been found, the water levels had actually been really high, and it is believed that this caused the Jane Doe to eventually float down the river and end up where she was. The autopsy came back stating that the cause of death had been strangulation due to the noose that was around her neck, and that she had suffered a very violent blow to the back of the head. When the dental records for the Jane Doe came in, it showed that she had an entire set of false teeth in her mouth, and that was able to identify her as Teresa Diane Smith, and she was 23 years old, and she went by Terry. Terry was last seen on December 22nd of 1973, and she grew up in a town that was actually just north of Garberville, California. Her mother continued to reside there while Terry grew up and eventually became married and became a mother herself. Terry decided one day that she was just going to leave her husband, I guess, like a divorce or something, and she was going to travel all over California. She was last seen hitchhiking in Zuma Beach, that was in Malibu, California, on December 23rd of 1973. Because Terry was last seen in Malibu and her body was found in Santa Rosa, this meant her body was found over 400 miles away from where she was last seen at. Whenever she left, Terry had been staying with some friends, and she told them that she was going to hitchhike to Garberville to go and visit her family for the first time in a very long time, and she ended up traveling through Santa Rosa. Terry's mother ended up reporting her missing on December 31st, 1973, when her daughter had not shown up for Christmas, and unfortunately this was actually 3 days after her body had been found, but it was before it had been identified. The police had tried to track down the killer through DNA on a rope, but unfortunately nothing came from this. And on July 2nd, 1979, this was 6 years after the last confirmed killing, after the killing of Terry. Skeletal remains were found only 100 yards away from where the body of Lori Cursa was. Because of the state of decomposition on the body, police were certain that it had to have been Jeanette Kamahale, because, you know, she was one of the people that had gone missing while hitchhiking. So they decided to do a test for dental records, and they realized that the dental records did not match Jeanette Kamahale's. The woman had been hogtied like Teresa and had received a broken arm in the process of being tied up. So they moved her arm back so bad that it ended up breaking the bone where her shoulder was. The remains had been found forcibly stuffed into a duffel bag, and this was tossed into the ravine in order to, I guess, like, get rid of it so no one would see it. Police believe that she had been between the ages of 16 to 21 years old, and she had died between 1973 and 1974. Police could not find any articles of clothing that were nearby, and they suspected it could have been 17-year-old Lisa Michelle Smith. And Lisa Michelle Smith, she was last seen hitchhiking in the Santa Rosa area and had never been seen again. 2 cases that are possibly linked to the serial killer of the Santa Rosa area are disappearances of 15-year-old Carrie Ann Graham and 14-year-old Francine Marie Trimble. And these were 2 girls who vanished from the Forestville, California area in 1978. And the remains were actually found off of a highway like the first 2 girls. And eventually their identities for Francine and the other girl, they ended up being identified in 2015. So the 2 had last been seen by a friend from school as they were attempting to hitchhike to a party that was in Santa Rosa. Francine's mother claimed the girls would never run away, and Carrie's mother didn't even list her as a missing person until 2006, when she failed to show up to a family reunion. In 1974, the FBI made an official statement that there were, in fact, are you ready for this? Y'all need to hold onto your seats for this. 14 murders in the Santa Rosa area between 1972 and 1974. 14! The FBI claimed that they believed it was the same murderer for each one, and there were a bunch of victims that people believed, that the FBI believed, that could have been connected to this serial killer that they're now starting to call the Santa Rosa Hitchhiker Killer, because most of the victims that this person did kill were in fact hitchhiking. So these are going to be all the victims that are possibly linked to the Santa Rosa Hitchhiker Killer. So the first victim I'm going to be talking about is 20-year-old Rosa Vasquez, and she was last seen hitchhiking on May 16th, 1973. 5 days later, her body was actually found on the Golden State Bridge. In case you don't know what the Golden State Bridge is, it's over by San Francisco. 15-year-old Yvonne Kilitang, and she was found murdered in a parking lot in the Bayview, California area in 1973 when she was actually 7 months pregnant. 16-year-old Angela Thomas, whose smothered body was found on an elementary school playground on July 2nd, 1973. Thank God school wasn't in session. I can only imagine how awful that would have been to see. 19-year-old Nancy Gidling, who went missing in July 1973 from a motel in Santa Rosa, and her body ended up being found only 3 days later, with Nancy being nude and she was missing an earring. So the fifth victim I'm going to be talking about that could be connected is also named Nancy, but it's not the same person. It's 22-year-old Nancy Fuzi, and she went missing after she went to a nightclub in Sacramento, California in 1973. Her remains ended up being found in July of that same year. The sixth person we're going to be talking about is 21-year-old Laura Odell, and she vanished on November 4th of 1973. Her remains ended up being found 3 days later in a bush with her hands tied behind her back, and she had been brutally strangled. Seventh one we're going to be talking about is 19-year-old Brenda Merchant, and she was found brutally murdered in her home in July 1st of 1974. The police connected this to possibly being the Santa Rosa Hitchhiker killer, but when I looked into it, it seemed like it was more so connected kind of to the Golden State Killer at that time, because he was breaking into people's houses and killing them, and it was around that same time period. And she hadn't been hitchhiking before her body was found. The eighth and final victim that was connected to this case is 14-year-old Donna Brown, and her remains ended up being found on September 29th, 1974 in the Salinas River. She had been bound and strangled to death. In each of these cases that I had discussed, the FBI feel that there was multiple similarities that could connect these cases to being involved with the Santa Rosa killer. At first, they considered there had to have been more than one killer, but the police quickly brushed that off, said no, there's only one. There's only one because of so many witnesses saying that they've seen this guy with an Afro-style haircut. And now I'm going to discuss about the theorized suspects. Of course, there's no official suspects. There's never been anything like an identity for this man, but these are people that the police think could possibly be the killer. So, the first suspect that the FBI had potentially linked to this case is the Zodiac Killer. And the Zodiac Killer was very similar. He had very similar crimes and locations to that area. And there was also a symbol that was said to have been found at Carolyn Davis's remains that looked similar, almost exactly the same as what the Zodiac Killer would leave behind, like his calling card. Something that is even more compelling is that the Zodiac Killer had actually claimed to have killed 37 people around the San Francisco Bay Area, and Santa Rosa is in the San Francisco Bay Area. The second suspect that people believe to be the killer is a man named Arthur Lee Allen. People actually believe that he might in fact be the serial killer known as the Zodiac Killer. But he lived in Santa Rosa, California, the same time as the killing spree by the serial killers, and he was even a student at the Sonoma State University. It's said that Arthur also had a very weird sexual attraction towards young girls and teenage girls, and most of the victims were between the ages of 12 and 16, so this would have been around his age range that he liked. He had been just... Oh, he's just so disgusting, that guy. Ugh. We ain't even going to talk about him. That's a whole other story for a whole other time. The third suspect police consider is Ted Bundy. Now, everybody knows who Ted Bundy is. He was a serial killer back in the 70s and 80s, and he would lure all these young girls to his house, and he would strangle them. So he had a very similar style of killings like the Santa Rosa hitchhiker had. He lived only a few miles away from Santa Rosa, and he would often lure hitchhikers into his car before going home and killing them. And he even told the police that there was an additional 27 victims that they didn't even know about. Which, of course, at the time, you know, when they arrested Ted Bundy, they thought they were just bullshitting him, but he might have been being serious. You never know. The next suspects were actually a killing duo, and they were known as the Hillside Stranglers. The duo's names were Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Bueno Jr., and they committed murders that were actually not far from the Santa Rosa area, and they were considered the prime suspects at this time. Also, with the amount of killings that had occurred at this time, it's possible there could have been 2 people involved. And as of Monday, March 21st, 2022, the Santa Rosa serial killer is still at large, and nobody has ever been identified as being him. And so that's just, it frustrates me because it's like this is a cold case, and I feel like it could be solved if people used DNA instead of then through a system like CODIS or whatever, that doing genetic genealogy like they did to find the Golden State Killer. You might be able to find this guy, the Santa Rosa Hitchhiker killer. And I would love to know what you guys think about the suspects, the cases in general. Do you think the ones that could possibly be related were actually part of it? Do you think that Ted Bundy was involved? Do you think it was the Zodiac Killer? Who do you think was the killer? I would love to know what you guys think down below in the comments section. Until next time, see you guys later.